The summer heat refused to surrender even after the sun had dipped below the Atlanta skyline. At 9:47 in the evening, the temperature still clung to 89 degrees, and the air hung thick and motionless between the glass towers of the financial district. Lieutenant Sarah Collins rolled down the window of her patrol unit, letting the warm breeze wash over her face as she guided the vehicle through the canyon of buildings that defined Peachtree Street. In the back seat, K-9 Max sat alert, his pointed ears rotating like satellite dishes, catching sounds that human ears could never hope to detect. The streets were quieter now. The rush of bankers, lawyers, and office workers had long since retreated to their homes in Buckhead and Midtown, leaving behind only the skeleton crew of security guards, late-night janitors, and the occasional delivery truck making rounds. Sarah liked this time of night. The city felt different when it exhaled, when the frantic pulse of commerce slowed to something more manageable. It was in these quieter moments that she often found the most interesting details, the small anomalies that daylight crowds would trample over without a second glance. She turned onto Baker Street, passing the imposing facade of First Regional Bank, its marble columns gleaming under the amber glow of streetlights. The building was a monument to old money, constructed in the 1920s when Atlanta was reinventing itself as the commercial heart of the New South. Now, it stood as one of the last independent banks in the city, stubbornly resisting acquisition by the national chains that had swallowed up its competitors one by one. Sarah was about to continue past when Max made a sound. It was not a bark, not a whine, but something in between, a vocalization she had learned to recognize over years of partnership. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him pressed against the window, his body rigid, his amber eyes fixed on something outside. She pulled the vehicle to the curb and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of air conditioning units on nearby rooftops. Sarah stepped out and opened the rear door, clipping the lead to Max's harness. The Belgian Malinois descended from the vehicle with fluid grace, his paws barely making a sound on the concrete. He immediately pulled toward the side of the bank building, toward the recessed alcove, where the night deposit box was mounted into the wall. Sarah followed, her hand resting instinctively on her duty belt. She had learned long ago to trust Max's instincts without question. The dog had an almost supernatural ability to detect things that were wrong, things that were out of place, things that demanded attention. In 7 years of service, he had never led her astray. The night deposit alcove was lit by a single fluorescent fixture that buzzed and flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across the metal drawer where business owners could drop their daily receipts after banking hours. Max approached the deposit slot and froze. His entire body went still, every muscle locked in place. His nose pointed directly at the metal opening like an arrow finding its target. Sarah crouched beside him, studying the deposit box. At first glance, everything appeared normal. The metal was smooth, unmarked, showing no signs of tampering or forced entry. But then she noticed it. A corner of white paper was visible at the edge of the slot, caught somehow in the mechanism, preventing the drawer from closing completely. She pulled a pair of nitrile gloves from her pocket and snapped them on. Gently, she tugged at the exposed paper. It resisted for a moment, then came free with a soft whisper of friction. It was a standard business envelope, slightly crumpled, with no return address or identifying marks. As she withdrew it from the slot, something small and metallic fell from inside the envelope and clattered against the concrete. Max's ears perked forward. Sarah picked up the object and held it under the flickering light. It was a USB flash drive. Black plastic casing, completely unremarkable except for a small strip of tape wrapped around it. On the tape, someone had written 3 words, in neat handwriting, proof of everything. Sarah felt the familiar tingle at the back of her neck, the one that always preceded something significant. She examined the envelope more closely. It was unsealed, the flap merely tucked inside rather than glued down. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper covered in dense typed text. The header read, "Transaction records, Guardian Trust accounts." She scanned the contents quickly, her eyes widening as she absorbed the implications. Column after column of account numbers, names, dates, and dollar amounts. Transfers ranging from a few thousand to several $100,000, all flowing in the same direction, all originating from accounts belonging to individuals whose ages, listed in a separate column, ranged from 67 to 94 years old. This was not a random document. This was evidence of something systematic, something calculated, something that had been happening right under everyone's noses. Sarah reached for her radio. Before she could key the microphone, Max growled low in his throat. She followed his gaze toward the far end of the alley that ran alongside the bank. A shadow moved there, quick and furtive, disappearing around the corner before she could get a clear look. She made a decision in an instant. The evidence went into an evidence bag from her kit. The bag went into her vest. Then she was moving, Max surging ahead on the lead, both of them flowing into the darkness of the alley like water finding its path downhill. The alley opened onto a service road behind the row of buildings. Dumpsters lined the walls, their lids closed against the heat and the vermin it attracted. Security lights mounted on the backs of buildings cast pools of illumination at irregular intervals, creating a patchwork of light and shadow that made visibility challenging. Max pulled hard to the left, his nose working overtime, picking up a scent trail that Sarah could only imagine. They rounded another corner and found themselves in a small parking area reserved for bank employees. Half a dozen vehicles sat in marked spaces, their windshields reflecting the dim glow of a single overhead lamp. Max led her directly to a silver sedan parked in the spot closest to the back entrance of the bank. He circled the vehicle once, then sat down beside the driver's door and looked up at Sarah with an expression that said everything she needed to know. She noted the license plate number, then peered through the tinted windows. The interior was immaculate, almost obsessively clean. A parking permit hung from the rearview mirror, bearing the logo of First Regional Bank and a name printed in small letters, Daniel Mercer, Senior Account Manager. Sarah stepped back and surveyed the area. The back door of the bank was solid steel, windowless, secured with both a keycard reader and a numeric keypad. A small camera mounted above the door pointed downward, its red LED indicating active recording. Whoever had been in that alley, whoever had dropped that envelope, they were gone now, vanished into the maze of downtown Atlanta. She keyed her radio and requested a records check on the vehicle. While she waited for dispatch to respond, she examined the envelope's contents more carefully. The transaction records spanned 18 months, documenting a pattern of systematic withdrawals from what appeared to be trust accounts managed by the bank. Each withdrawal was small enough to avoid automatic fraud detection, usually between $2,000 and $5,000, but the cumulative total was staggering. By her quick calculation, more than $4 million had been siphoned from these accounts. Dispatch came back with the vehicle registration. The sedan belonged to Daniel Mercer, age 41, residing at an address in the Virginia Highland neighborhood. No warrants, no criminal history, not even a parking ticket in the past 5 years. On paper, he was a model citizen. Sarah thanked dispatch and ended the transmission. She stood in the empty parking lot, the heat pressing down on her like a physical weight, and considered her options. The evidence in her possession suggested a major financial crime in progress, but evidence obtained from an unsealed envelope in a night deposit slot presented complicated legal questions. She needed more information before she could move forward. Max whined softly, drawing her attention. He had moved to the edge of the parking area and was staring down a narrow passage between two buildings. Sarah approached, and saw what had captured his interest. A security camera, mounted high on the wall, pointed toward the passage. If she could access that footage, she might be able to identify who had left the envelope in the deposit slot. She made a note of the camera's location and the building it was attached to, then led Max back to their vehicle. The night was still young, and there was much work to be done. The Atlanta Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit occupied a suite of offices on the 4th floor of the Zone 5 precinct building. Sarah arrived just after 11, Max padding silently beside her through the fluorescent-lit corridors. At this hour, the unit was staffed by a skeleton crew, but she knew exactly who she needed to see. Detective Marcus Webb sat hunched over his desk, surrounded by towers of paper that threatened to collapse at any moment. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with grey hair that had given up any pretense of style years ago, and glasses that perpetually slid down his nose. What he lacked in physical presence, he more than made up for in expertise. Marcus had spent 30 years investigating financial crimes, from simple check fraud to complex money laundering operations. If anyone could make sense of what Sarah had found, it was him. He looked up as she approached, his eyes registering surprise at seeing her in his territory at this hour. Sarah pulled up a chair and laid the evidence bag on his desk without preamble. She explained how Max had alerted at the night deposit, how she had recovered the envelope, what the documents appeared to show. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When she finished, he picked up the evidence bag and examined its contents through the plastic. His fingers traced the columns of numbers, his lips moving silently as he performed mental calculations. After several minutes, he set the bag down and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. What Sarah had stumbled onto was not a simple case of embezzlement. The transaction records suggested a carefully orchestrated scheme targeting elderly clients with trust accounts at First Regional Bank. The withdrawals were structured to avoid detection, spread across multiple accounts, and disguised as legitimate expenses such as medical bills, home repairs, and insurance premiums. The sophistication of the operation indicated multiple participants working in coordination, with inside access to the bank systems and detailed knowledge of the victim's personal information. Marcus pulled up his database and began running the account numbers through various search protocols. Within minutes, he had confirmed that several of the accounts belonged to clients who had filed complaints with the bank over the past year, reporting unauthorized charges and missing funds. In each case, the complaints had been investigated internally and dismissed as customer error or confusion. The complainants, all elderly and living alone, had been told that they had simply forgotten authorizing the transactions. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. The exploitation of vulnerable seniors was a crime that hit close to home for many in law enforcement. These were people who had worked their entire lives, saved diligently for retirement, trusted institutions to safeguard their futures. To have that trust betrayed by the very people paid to protect their interests was a violation that demanded justice. Marcus suggested they examine the flash drive. Using an isolated computer not connected to any network, he inserted the USB device and navigated through its contents. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. The drive contained not just transaction records, but detailed profiles of each victim, including their medical conditions, family situations, cognitive assessments, and notes about how isolated they were from relatives who might notice discrepancies. There were also internal emails between bank employees discussing which clients were the most vulnerable targets and strategies for deflecting suspicion when complaints arose. The emails were damning. They revealed a network of at least 5 bank employees working together, led by someone referred to only as the coordinator. The coordinator appeared to be the mastermind, directing operations. approving targets, and managing the distribution of stolen funds. The communications were careful never to use real names, but references to job titles and responsibilities made it possible to begin mapping the organization. Sarah studied the victim profiles with growing anger. Mildred Patterson, 83, widow, early-stage dementia, no children, nearest relative and nephew in Oregon, who visited once a year. Robert Chen, 79, retired engineer, stroke survivor with limited mobility, estranged from adult children following a family dispute. Eleanor Washington, 88, former schoolteacher, legally blind, dependent on a home health aide who came twice weekly. The criminals had selected their victims with predatory precision, choosing people who were unlikely to detect the theft and even more unlikely to be believed if they reported it. Marcus leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. Building a case of this magnitude would require careful planning, extensive resources, and the involvement of multiple agencies. The FBI would likely want jurisdiction given the dollar amounts involved. The district attorney's office would need to be briefed. Search warrants would have to be obtained for bank records, personal computers, and financial accounts. It was the kind of investigation that typically took months to develop. Sarah had a different idea. The evidence on the flash drive was powerful, but it had been obtained under circumstances that might not survive legal scrutiny. Defense attorneys would argue chain of custody issues, question whether the documents had been planted, challenge the authenticity of the emails. What they needed was independent corroboration, evidence gathered through traditional investigative methods that could stand up in court. She proposed starting with the victims. If they could interview the people whose accounts had been drained, document their experiences, and establish a pattern of fraud that matched the records on the flash drive, they would have a case that no defense attorney could dismiss. Marcus agreed, though he cautioned that many of the victims might not be reliable witnesses due to their age and health conditions. They would need to approach each interview with sensitivity and patience. They spent the next 2 hours dividing up the list of victims and planning their approach. Sarah would handle the initial contacts, using her rapport-building skills and Max's calming presence to put the elderly clients at ease. Marcus would work the financial angle, tracing the stolen funds through the labyrinth of accounts and shell companies that the criminals had used to hide their tracks. They agreed to meet daily to share findings and coordinate their efforts. By the time Sarah left the precinct, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. She drove home through empty streets, Max dozing in the back seat, the weight of the investigation pressing on her mind. Somewhere in this city, a group of criminals was sleeping soundly, confident that their scheme was invisible, their victims too weak to fight back. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The morning brought a wall of humidity that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. Sarah woke to find Max standing at her bedroom door, his tail wagging slowly, ready for whatever the day would bring. She showered quickly, dressed in civilian clothes that would be less intimidating for the interviews ahead, and loaded Max into her personal vehicle. The dog seemed to understand that today was different from their usual routine, settling into the passenger seat with an alertness that matched her own. Her first stop was a modest brick apartment building in the Grant Park neighborhood, home to Mildred Patterson. According to the files on the flash drive, Mrs. Patterson had lost over $60,000 over the past 14 months, drained from an account that should have been providing for her care during her final years. Sarah climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, Max walking calmly beside her, and knocked on apartment 3B. The woman who answered was small and frail, with white hair gathered in a loose bun and eyes that had once been bright blue but had faded to a watery grey. She looked at Sarah with the wariness of someone who had learned that strangers rarely brought good news. When Sarah introduced herself and explained that she was investigating potential fraud at First Regional Bank, Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from suspicion to something closer to hope. She invited them inside. The apartment was clean but sparse, furnished with pieces that had clearly seen decades of use. Photographs covered every available surface, images of children and grandchildren at various ages, wedding portraits, graduation ceremonies, a visual chronicle of a life well lived. Mrs. Patterson lowered herself into an armchair and gestured for Sarah to sit on the sofa opposite. Max positioned himself at Sarah's feet, his calm presence filling the room. Mrs. Patterson's story emerged slowly, pieced together from fragments of memory that sometimes contradicted each other. She had banked with First Regional for over 40 years, since before her husband passed. The trust account had been set up by her late daughter, designed to cover medical expenses and assisted living costs when the time came. For years, everything had worked smoothly. Then, about 18 months ago, things started to go wrong. She began noticing discrepancies in her monthly statements, charges she did not recognize, withdrawals she did not remember authorizing. When she called the bank to inquire, she was transferred multiple times before reaching a young man who spoke quickly and used words she did not understand. He assured her that everything was in order, that the charges were legitimate, that she had simply forgotten signing the authorization forms. When she insisted that she had not authorized anything, he became patronizing, suggesting that perhaps her memory was not as reliable as she believed. The pattern repeated itself over the following months. Each time she noticed something wrong, she would call the bank, and each time she would be dismissed with the same condescending assurances. She had tried to involve her nephew, but he lived 3,000 miles away and could only offer sympathy over the phone. She had considered hiring a lawyer, but the costs seemed prohibitive, and she was not even sure she had a case. Eventually, she had simply given up, resigned to watching her savings disappear and hoping there would be enough left to cover her needs. Sarah listened without interrupting, taking careful notes and recording the conversation with Mrs. Patterson's permission. When the elderly woman finished, her eyes were wet with tears that she made no effort to hide. Sarah reached across and took her hand gently. She promised that Mrs. Patterson's case was being taken seriously, that she was not alone, that the people who had stolen from her would be held accountable. Before leaving, Sarah asked if Mrs. Patterson could identify the bank employees she had spoken with when reporting the discrepancies. The elderly woman could not remember names, but she recalled that the young man who had been most dismissive worked in the trust department and had a voice that she described as smooth like a radio announcer. Sarah made a note of the description and thanked Mrs. Patterson for her courage in coming forward. The second interview was scheduled for noon at a senior living facility in Decatur, where Robert Chen resided. The building was newer than Mrs. Patterson's apartment, a sprawling complex with manicured grounds and a lobby that smelled of fresh flowers and disinfectant. Sarah checked in at the front desk, explained her purpose, and was escorted to Mr. Chen's room by a nursing assistant who seemed curious but asked no questions. Robert Chen was a different kind of witness. Despite the stroke that had limited his mobility, his mind remained sharp, his engineer's precision intact. He sat in a motorized wheelchair, his thin frame wrapped in a cardigan despite the summer heat, and regarded Sarah with eyes that missed nothing. When she explained why she was there, he nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for this conversation for a long time. His account was more detailed than Mrs. Patterson's, organized into a mental timeline that he could navigate with ease. He had first noticed unauthorized transactions approximately 16 months ago, shortly after his stroke had forced him into the assisted living facility. At first, he had assumed the charges were related to his care, mistakenly billed to his personal account rather than his insurance. When he called the bank to clarify, he was told that the charges were legitimate and that he had authorized them through a signed form. Mr. Chen had demanded to see the form. After several weeks of persistent calls, he was finally sent a copy by mail. The signature on the form was not his. It was close enough to fool a casual observer, but Mr. Chen had spent 40 years signing engineering documents and could recognize his own handwriting instantly. He had reported the forgery to the bank and demanded an investigation. The response had been infuriating. An internal review concluded that the signature was authentic and that Mr. Chen's claim was unfounded. Case closed. Sarah asked if he still had the copy of the forged form. Mr. Chen smiled grimly and directed her to a filing cabinet in the corner of his room. The bottom drawer contained a thick folder labeled Bank Fraud, organized chronologically and cross-referenced with his own notes. He had documented everything, from phone call logs to copies of correspondence to detailed records of every suspicious transaction. He had been building his own case, waiting for someone who would listen. Sarah spent an hour reviewing his documentation, photographing key documents with her phone, and asking clarifying questions. Mr. Chen's records corroborated the data on the flash drive with remarkable precision, providing independent verification that would be invaluable in court. More importantly, his forged signature form was concrete evidence of criminal activity, something that could be analyzed by forensic experts and presented to a jury. Before she left, Sarah asked Mr. Chen why he had not gone to the police earlier. He was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window and the courtyard beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. He had been told his entire life that the system worked, that institutions could be trusted, that wrongs would be righted if you followed the proper channels. His experience with the bank had shattered those beliefs. He had not gone to the police because he no longer believed the police would help. He was an old man in a wheelchair, challenging a respected financial institution. Who would take his side? Sarah met his eyes directly. She would, she said, and she would not stop until the people who had done this to him were behind bars. Mr. Chen studied her face for a long moment, searching for any sign of the empty promises he had heard before. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. He nodded once and wished her luck. The third interview was supposed to be with Eleanor Washington, but when Sarah arrived at the address listed in the files, she found only an empty apartment. A neighbor explained that Mrs. Washington had passed away 3 months earlier, her health declining rapidly after she lost most of her savings to what her family believed was a phone scam. The neighbor did not know the details, but mentioned that Mrs. Washington's great-niece had handled the estate and might have more information. Sarah obtained the great-niece's contact information and made a call from her car. The conversation was brief but illuminating. Angela Washington was a paralegal who worked at a downtown firm, and she had suspected from the beginning that her great-aunt's financial troubles were not the result of random phone scammers. She had reviewed the bank statements after Mrs. Washington's death and noticed patterns that seemed too systematic to be coincidence. She had tried to raise concerns with the bank, but had been stonewalled at every turn. She had been about to give up when Sarah's call came through. They agreed to meet the following day so that Angela could share her documentation. Sarah ended the call and sat in silence, the weight of the case settling more heavily on her shoulders. 3 victims, 3 stories of betrayal and dismissal. And according to the flash drive, there were at least a dozen more. Max stirred in the passenger seat, his nose twitching as a squirrel darted across the parking lot. Sarah reached over and scratched behind his ears, drawing comfort from the simple contact. They had work to do, and the day was far from over. The afternoon was dedicated to surveillance. Sarah drove to the Virginia Highland address associated with Daniel Mercer, the senior account manager whose car Max had alerted on the previous night. The house was a renovated craftsman bungalow, well-maintained, with a late-model luxury SUV parked in the driveway, alongside the silver sedan she had seen at the bank. The property was worth at least $500,000, far more than a bank employee's salary would typically support. She parked down the street and observed the house through binoculars, Max alert beside her. After about an hour, the front door opened and a man emerged. He appeared to be in his early 40s, fit and tan, dressed in golf attire that looked expensive even from a distance. He climbed into the SUV and backed out of the driveway, heading north toward the country clubs in the Buckhead area. Sarah followed at a discreet distance, maintaining visual contact without getting close enough to spook her target. Mercer drove with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable, weaving through traffic with casual disregard for speed limits. He eventually turned into the entrance of a private golf course, flashing a membership card at the gate before disappearing down the tree-lined drive. She pulled over and made notes about the time and location, adding another data point to the financial profile she was building. Membership at that particular club ran upwards of $50,000 per year, another expense that seemed inconsistent with Mercer's legitimate income. Either he had family money that did not appear in public records, or he had sources of income that he preferred to keep hidden. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. He had completed his preliminary trace of the stolen funds and found something interesting. The money did not disappear into overseas accounts or cryptocurrency exchanges, as was typical in sophisticated fraud schemes. Instead, it flowed through a series of local shell companies before being converted into tangible assets, primarily real estate and luxury goods. Someone was building a portfolio of wealth right here in Atlanta, hiding in plain sight. Sarah returned to the precinct to review Marcus's findings. The shell companies had names that sounded legitimate, things like Peachtree Property Solutions and Southern Trust Holdings, but their corporate filings revealed almost nothing about their actual ownership or operations. Each company was registered to a different law firm. Each law firm claimed attorney-client privilege when questioned, and the trail went cold at every turn. But Marcus had found a crack in the wall. One of the shell companies had recently purchased a condominium in a downtown high-rise, and the purchase documents included a signature that matched the handwriting on several of the fraudulent authorization forms from the victim accounts. The signature belonged to someone named Thomas Blackwell, a name that appeared nowhere in the bank's employee records, but seemed to be an alias used by whoever was coordinating the operation. Sarah spent the evening reviewing everything they had gathered, organizing the evidence into a timeline that would support a formal investigation. The case was taking shape, but critical pieces were still missing. They had victims, they had evidence of fraud, they had suspicious financial connections. What they did not have was direct proof linking specific individuals to specific crimes. Without that link, defense attorneys would pick apart the circumstantial case and create enough reasonable doubt to secure acquittals. She needed someone on the inside, someone who knew how the scheme operated, who could testify to the mechanics of the fraud and identify the participants. The question was how to find that person without alerting the conspirators that their operation was compromised. Max lay at her feet as she worked, occasionally lifting his head to check on her before settling back into his watchful rest. She reached down and stroked his smooth coat, finding comfort in the warmth of his presence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new interviews, new opportunities to uncover the truth. For now, all she could do was prepare. The next morning brought clouds that promised relief from the relentless heat, but delivered only humidity and a sky the color of dirty cotton. Sarah arrived at Angela Washington's downtown office at 9 sharp. Max waiting patiently in the car, with the windows cracked and the air conditioning running on low. The paralegal met her in the lobby, A tall woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and a professional demeanor that softened when Sarah explained the progress of the investigation. Angela had brought a banker's box filled with documents related to her great-aunt's finances. The two women sat in a conference room, sorting through statements and correspondence, while Angela described what she had uncovered after Mrs. Washington's death. The pattern matched what Sarah had seen in the other cases: systematic withdrawals disguised as legitimate expenses, dismissive responses to inquiries, a slow bleeding of assets that had accelerated as the victim's health declined. But Angela had found something that the others had not. Among her great-aunt's personal effects was a journal, a daily record of thoughts and observations that Mrs. Washington had maintained despite her failing eyesight. The entries were brief, often no more than a sentence or two, but they documented interactions with bank personnel in surprising detail. Mrs. Washington had written about a particular employee who called regularly to check on her, a young woman with a pleasant voice who asked probing questions about her health, her family, her daily routine. The caller had introduced herself as a customer service representative, but her questions went far beyond normal banking inquiries. Sarah photographed the relevant journal entries and asked if Angela could identify the caller. The paralegal shook her head, but mentioned that her great-aunt had once referred to the woman by name, something that sounded like Karen or Carrie. She could not remember exactly, but she was certain that the name appeared somewhere in the documents. They continued searching until Angela found it, a handwritten note in Mrs. Washington's shaky script tucked into a bank statement from over a year ago. The note read, "Called by Carolyn today. Nice girl, but asks too many questions. Must remember to ask Daniel about this." Daniel. The name matched Daniel Mercer, the account manager whose car Max had alerted on, and Carolyn could be cross-referenced against the bank's employee records, potentially identifying another member of the conspiracy. Sarah thanked Angela for her assistance and promised to keep her informed of developments. The paralegal's eyes were hard as she shook Sarah's hand. She wanted justice for her great-aunt, and she made it clear that she would do whatever was necessary to help achieve it. Sarah drove directly to the precinct and requested a record search for any employee named Carolyn, currently or previously working at First Regional Bank. The search returned a single result. Carolyn Fisher, age 28, employed as a client relations specialist in the trust department. Her personnel file showed an exemplary record, glowing performance reviews, multiple commendations for customer service excellence. She had been with the bank for 4 years, hired shortly after graduating from a local business college. The photograph in her file showed a young woman with an earnest expression and a smile that suggested warmth and trustworthiness. Sarah studied the image and wondered how that smile looked when its owner was pumping vulnerable seniors for information that would be used to rob them blind. Marcus had news of his own. His forensic analysis of the shell company transactions had uncovered a connection to a property management firm that maintained several rental properties across the metro area. One of those properties was a warehouse in an industrial district south of the city, leased under a corporate name but paid for with funds that could be traced back to the stolen accounts. The warehouse was supposed to be used for storage, but utility records showed electricity consumption far higher than would be expected for an empty building. They decided to take a look. Sarah retrieved Max from the car, the dog instantly alert to the change in atmosphere, and met Marcus in the parking garage. They took an unmarked vehicle, Marcus driving while Sarah reviewed satellite imagery of the warehouse district on her phone. The area was a mixture of legitimate businesses and abandoned properties, the kind of place where questionable activities could occur with minimal oversight. The warehouse in question was a squat concrete structure surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A faded sign on the fence identified it as property of Southern Industrial Storage, one of the shell companies Marcus had identified in his analysis. The parking area was empty, except for a single white van with commercial plates and no identifying markings. They parked a block away and approached on foot, staying in the shadows of adjacent buildings. Max walked between them, his ears swiveling constantly, his body tense with controlled energy. As they neared the fence, the dog stopped and lifted his nose to the air, testing the scents carried on the humid breeze. After a moment, he looked at Sarah and whined softly. She understood. Something was happening inside that building, something that had caught Max's attention. But they could not simply enter the property without a warrant, and they had no probable cause to justify obtaining one. The connection between the warehouse and the fraud scheme was circumstantial at best, certainly not enough to convince a judge to authorize a search. Marcus suggested a different approach. They could request that the property owner or leaseholder grant them access voluntarily. If the warehouse was being used legitimately, the occupants would have no reason to refuse. If they did refuse, their reaction might provide the additional evidence needed to justify further investigation. Sarah agreed with the strategy, but cautioned that they needed to be careful not to tip off the suspects. If the warehouse was connected to the fraud operation, the people running it would destroy evidence the moment they realized they were under scrutiny. They needed to approach in a way that seemed routine, unthreatening, just two investigators following up on a minor administrative matter. They returned to their vehicle and drove to the main entrance of the industrial park, where a security booth controlled access to the various properties within. The guard on duty was an older man who looked like he had seen better days. Slumped in his chair with a tabloid magazine open on his lap, he straightened when he saw the badge that Sarah held up to his window. She explained that they were conducting a routine inquiry related to a vehicle registration issue and needed to speak with someone at the Southern Industrial Storage property. The guard checked his clipboard and informed her that the property was leased to a company called Magnolia Ventures, operated by someone named Thomas Blackwell. He provided a contact phone number and suggested they call ahead, as Mr. Blackwell was particular about visitors. The name Thomas Blackwell confirmed their suspicions. This was the same alias used on the fraudulent property purchases, the same name that appeared on forged authorization documents. The warehouse was not just connected to the fraud operation, it was a central node, possibly the headquarters of the entire scheme. Sarah thanked the guard and took note of the phone number. She had no intention of calling ahead to warn their target, but the information might prove useful later. They retreated to a coffee shop outside the industrial park to plan their next move. The challenge was clear. They had established connections between the fraud victims, the bank employees, the shell companies, and now the warehouse, but each link in the chain relied on circumstantial evidence and analysis. To make arrests that would stick, they needed direct testimony from someone inside the organization or physical evidence obtained through a legal search. Otherwise, defense attorneys would construct alternative explanations for each piece of evidence, and the case would collapse under reasonable doubt. Marcus suggested approaching one of the lower-level participants, someone who might be motivated to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Carolyn Fisher seemed like a potential candidate. She was young, relatively new to the scheme, and might not fully appreciate the seriousness of the charges she was facing. If they could convince her that the operation was compromised and that cooperation was her best option, she might provide the testimony they needed. Sarah was skeptical. Approaching a suspect directly risked alerting the entire network. If Carolyn was loyal to her co-conspirators, she would immediately report the contact and everyone would scatter. They needed to isolate her first, create circumstances where she felt vulnerable and alone before making their approach. She proposed a different strategy. They would continue building their case through victim interviews and financial analysis, documenting the full scope of the fraud without revealing their progress to the suspects. Simultaneously, they would conduct discreet surveillance of the key players, looking for opportunities to gather additional evidence. When they had enough to justify arrest warrants, they would move quickly, taking all the suspects into custody before any of them had a chance to flee or destroy evidence. Marcus nodded slowly, acknowledging the wisdom of patience even as his expression betrayed his desire for faster action. They had victims who were suffering, criminals who were profiting, and every day of delay meant more money stolen, more lives damaged. But rushing the investigation would only benefit the perpetrators in the long run. They spent the rest of the day interviewing additional victims, each conversation adding another layer of detail to the picture they were constructing. Harold Martinez, 71, a retired postal worker who had lost his entire pension to fraudulent medical expense claims. Barbara Simmons, 81, a widow whose late husband's life insurance settlement had been systematically drained over 2 years. Samuel and Dorothy Green, both in their late 70s, a couple who had watched their travel savings disappear just as they were preparing to celebrate their 50th anniversary with a cruise they had planned for decades. The stories were heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. These were not wealthy people with resources to absorb the losses. They were ordinary citizens who had worked hard, saved carefully, and trusted that the institutions they relied upon would protect their interests. That trust had been weaponized against them, turned into a tool for exploitation by people without conscience or remorse. Sarah returned home that evening exhausted, but determined. Max seemed to sense her mood, staying close as she moved through her routine, his warm presence a constant comfort. She sat on her porch as darkness fell, watching the city lights flicker to life across the horizon, thinking about the victims she had met and the justice they deserved. The investigation continued for another week, each day bringing new evidence and new complications. Marcus traced additional shell company transactions, revealing a network of financial instruments that extended across state lines and involved dozens of accounts. The total amount stolen exceeded initial estimates, climbing past $6 million as more victims were identified and their losses documented. Sarah interviewed a total of 15 victims, recording their testimonies and gathering documentation that corroborated the data on the flash drive. Several patterns emerged from the conversations. All of the victims had received regular phone calls from bank representatives who claimed to be checking on their accounts. All had noticed discrepancies in their statements, but had been dismissed when they raised concerns. All had eventually given up, accepting their losses as the price of age and declining memory. The surveillance of Daniel Mercer and Carolyn Fisher revealed their daily routines, their social connections, their spending habits. Mercer lived well beyond his apparent means, dining at expensive restaurants, driving luxury vehicles, taking weekend trips to resort destinations. Fisher was more modest in her lifestyle, but had recently moved into a new apartment in a trendy neighborhood, a unit that should have been well outside her salary range. The warehouse remained a mystery. Vehicles came and went at irregular intervals, but the team could not determine what was happening inside without risking disclosure of their investigation. Marcus speculated that it might be used for processing documents, storing evidence, or conducting meetings away from the bank where security cameras might capture incriminating footage. Whatever its purpose, it was clearly important enough to warrant significant investment in security and concealment. The break they needed came unexpectedly, as breaks often do. Sarah was reviewing her interview recordings when she noticed something odd in her conversation with Robert Chen. The elderly engineer had mentioned that shortly before his stroke, he had received a phone call from someone at the bank warning him about suspicious activity on his account. The caller had seemed genuinely concerned, different from the dismissive representatives he had dealt with later. Mr. Chen could not remember the caller's name, but he recalled that the voice had been male and nervous, as if the caller was taking a risk by making contact. Sarah played the recording several times, focusing on Mr. Chen's exact words. The call had come approximately 2 weeks before his stroke, which meant it occurred about 18 months ago, right around the time the fraud scheme seemed to have intensified. If someone inside the bank had tried to warn a victim, that person might still be there, might still be willing to help expose the operation. She cross-referenced the timeline with employee records from First Regional Bank, looking for anyone who had left or been terminated around that period. One name stood out: Gregory Tran, a junior account specialist who had resigned without notice approximately 17 months ago, just after the date when Mr. Chen received his warning call. His personnel file noted that his departure was unexpected and that his supervisors had been surprised by his sudden decision to leave. Finding Gregory Tran proved challenging. He had moved out of his apartment shortly after leaving the bank and had not updated his address with the postal service. His social media accounts had been deleted, his phone number disconnected. It was as if he had deliberately tried to disappear. Marcus worked his contacts in the financial industry, while Sarah reached out to former colleagues at the bank. After 2 days of searching, they finally caught a break. Gregory had been spotted working at a coffee shop in Marietta, a suburb north of the city. He was using a different name, but had been recognized by a former co-worker who happened to stop in for a latte. Sarah drove to Marietta the next morning, Max riding beside her with his usual calm alertness. The coffee shop was a small, independent operation, the kind of place that attracted students and artists with its mismatched furniture and locally roasted beans. She parked across the street and observed through the window until she spotted a young Asian man behind the counter, his movements quick and practiced as he prepared drinks for a steady stream of customers. She waited until the morning rush subsided before entering. Max stayed in the car, the windows cracked against the lingering warmth. Sarah ordered a coffee she did not want and found a seat near the counter where she could observe without being obvious. Gregory moved efficiently through his tasks, pleasant with customers but guarded, his eyes constantly scanning the room as if watching for threats. When the shop finally emptied, Sarah approached the counter. She introduced herself quietly, showing her badge below the counter level where other customers would not see. Gregory's face went pale, his hands freezing in the midst of wiping down the espresso machine. For a moment, she thought he might run. Then his shoulders sagged, and something like relief flickered across his features. They talked in a back room, away from the few customers who wandered in during their conversation. Gregory's story confirmed everything Sarah had suspected and revealed details that exceeded her expectations. He had been recruited into the fraud scheme shortly after joining First Regional Bank, approached by Daniel Mercer with promises of easy money and assurances that no one would ever get caught. At first, the amounts seemed small, a few $100s here and there, victimless crimes against wealthy clients who would never miss the money. But the operation had grown, and the victims had changed. Gregory began to realize that they were targeting people who could not afford the losses, elderly individuals with limited resources and no one to advocate for them. He had grown increasingly uncomfortable, but by then he was in too deep. He knew too much, had participated too often. Leaving the scheme meant risking exposure, and the others had made it clear that exposure would not be tolerated. He had tried to warn Robert Chen, reaching out anonymously in a moment of desperate conscience, but the call had not made a difference, and Gregory had realized that his only option was to disappear. He had emptied his bank account, quit his job without notice, and fled to Marietta, hoping to start over under a new identity. He had been living in fear ever since, waiting for the day when his former associates would track him down. Sarah listened without judgment, recognizing the complexity of his situation. Gregory was not an innocent victim, but neither was he a hardened criminal. He had made bad choices, allowed himself to be manipulated, and was now paying the price of those decisions. More importantly, he possessed the inside knowledge that could bring down the entire operation. She offered him a deal: full cooperation in exchange for consideration from the district attorney, likely reduced charges, and a recommendation for probation rather than prison time. Gregory would need to testify against his former colleagues, identify every member of the conspiracy, explain exactly how the scheme operated. It would not be easy, and it would not be safe, but it was his best chance at redemption. Gregory asked for time to think. Sarah gave him her card and told him she would wait for his call. She left the coffee shop without looking back, knowing that the decision he faced was one only he could make. Some people found courage when cornered. Others found excuses. She would know which category Gregory fell into soon enough. The call came that night. Gregory agreed to cooperate, his voice shaky but determined. He would tell them everything, name everyone, testify in court if necessary. All he asked in return was protection from the people he was betraying. Sarah immediately contacted Marcus and their supervisor to arrange a formal debriefing. Gregory was brought to the precinct under escort, his identity concealed from anyone who did not need to know. For the next 12 hours, he provided a detailed account of the fraud operation that exceeded anything they had imagined. The scheme had been operating for nearly 3 years, growing from opportunistic theft by a few bank employees to a sophisticated enterprise involving 7 participants across multiple departments. Daniel Mercer was the operational leader, responsible for selecting targets, coordinating withdrawals, and managing the distribution of proceeds. Carolyn Fisher served as the primary contact with victims, using her skills at manipulation to extract personal information and deflect suspicion. Thomas Blackwell, whose real name was actually Thomas Mercer, was Daniel's cousin, brought in to handle the financial side of the operation, creating shell companies and laundering stolen funds through real estate and other investments. The other participants included a branch manager who approved fraudulent paperwork, a tech specialist who manipulated computer records to hide the theft, and 2 junior employees who handled the logistics of document production and cash movement. Gregory had been involved primarily in the technology side, helping to create fake authorization forms and alter transaction records. He provided detailed information about each participant's role, their methods of communication, their security precautions, and the location of evidence that could be used to prove their crimes. The warehouse south of the city was indeed central to the operation. It housed printing equipment for creating fraudulent documents, servers containing financial records, and a cache of physical evidence, including forged signatures, fake identification documents, and ledgers tracking every transaction. Gregory estimated that the warehouse contained enough evidence to prove the entire scheme beyond any reasonable doubt. With Gregory's cooperation secured, the investigation moved into its final phase. Sarah worked with prosecutors to obtain arrest warrants for all 7 participants, coordinated with the FBI given the scope and dollar amounts involved, and assembled tactical teams to execute simultaneous raids across multiple locations. The timing had to be precise. If any of the suspects learned of the arrests before they could be taken into custody, they might flee, destroy evidence, or worse, harm potential witnesses. The operation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, chosen because analysis of the suspects' routines showed it was the time when they were most likely to be at predictable locations. Sarah would lead the team assigned to arrest Daniel Mercer at his home. Marcus would coordinate the raid on the warehouse. FBI agents would handle the arrests of Thomas Blackwell and the branch manager, while other teams moved on Carolyn Fisher and the remaining participants. The night before the operation, Sarah sat in her living room with Max at her feet, reviewing the plan one final time. Every contingency had been anticipated, every detail verified. They had overwhelming evidence, reliable testimony, and the element of surprise. In less than 12 hours, the people who had stolen millions from vulnerable seniors would be in handcuffs, their operation dismantled, their victims vindicated. Max lifted his head and regarded her with those intelligent amber eyes. Sarah reached down and stroked his ears, drawing comfort from his steady presence. They had started this journey together, at a night deposit slot on a hot summer evening, following a hunch that had led them through weeks of investigation and dozens of interviews. Now they would finish it together. Dawn broke hazy and warm, the kind of morning that promised another scorching day. Sarah was in position by 6, parked down the street from Daniel Mercer's house with Max in the back seat and 2 backup units concealed nearby. The neighborhood was quiet, residents still sleeping, newspaper delivery trucks making their rounds. She watched the house through binoculars, waiting for the signal to move. At exactly 6:15, her radio crackled with the command. All teams were in position and ready. The operation was greenlit. Sarah stepped out of her vehicle and approached the house with practiced calm, Max walking beside her on a short lead. The 2 backup officers fell in behind, their presence meant to discourage any thoughts of resistance. She mounted the front steps and knocked firmly on the door, announcing herself and her purpose in a clear, steady voice. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened, and Daniel Mercer stood before her, his face a mask of confusion that quickly shifted to something darker as he recognized her badge. He tried to close the door, but Sarah was faster, her foot already in the gap, her hand reaching for his arm. The arrest was clean and professional. Mercer was handcuffed without violence, read his rights, and escorted to the waiting vehicle. His wife appeared in the doorway as they led him away, her expression horrified, her questions going unanswered. Inside the house, forensic teams were already beginning their search, cataloguing every item that might serve as evidence. Reports came in from the other teams. Over the following hour, Thomas Blackwell had been arrested at his apartment without incident. The branch manager had attempted to flee through a back door and had been tackled by agents in the parking lot. Carolyn Fisher had broken down in tears when confronted, confessing to everything before the agents could even begin their questioning. The warehouse raid had yielded a treasure trove of evidence, exactly as Gregory had described. By noon, all 7 participants were in custody, their operation shattered, their victims' money traced and frozen pending recovery. The news broke later that afternoon, reporters descending on the precinct with cameras and questions. Sarah declined to be interviewed, preferring to let the district attorney handle the public statements. Her work was done. The aftermath stretched over weeks. The defendant's attorneys filed motions, challenged evidence, and attempted to discredit Gregory's testimony, but the case was too strong, the evidence too overwhelming. One by one, the participants accepted plea deals rather than face trial, their sentences ranging from probation for the least culpable to decades in prison for the ringleaders. Daniel Mercer was sentenced to 25 years, his cousin Thomas to 20. The branch manager received 15 years, the tech specialist 12. Carolyn Fisher, whose cooperation after arrest had helped secure additional convictions, was sentenced to 3 years with eligibility for early release. The junior employees received probation and community service, their youth and peripheral involvement earning them leniency that the organizers did not deserve. The recovered funds were distributed to the victims through a court-supervised process. Not all of the money could be traced, and some victims had passed away before restitution could be arranged, but the majority received significant compensation for their losses. Mildred Patterson was able to remain in her apartment, her care funded by the restored trust account. Robert Chen, used his settlement to hire a personal assistant who helped him navigate daily life with dignity. The green couple finally took their anniversary cruise, 50 years late, but no less meaningful. For Sarah, the resolution of the case brought a deep satisfaction, tempered by the awareness that justice, while achieved, could not undo the suffering that had been inflicted. The victims had been violated in ways that went beyond financial loss. Their trust in institutions, their confidence in their own minds, their sense of security in a world that had suddenly revealed itself to be predatory and cruel. These were wounds that money could not heal. She stood outside the courthouse on the day of the final sentencing, Max sitting calmly at her side, watching as reporters surrounded the prosecutor and defense attorneys engaged in their predictable theater. The sun was setting behind the skyline, painting the glass towers in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the city, other schemes were operating. Other victims were being exploited. Other criminals were counting their gains and believing themselves untouchable. But they were not untouchable. Sarah had proven that. A dog's instinct at a night deposit slot, an envelope caught in a mechanism, a small piece of evidence that should have been invisible but was not. That was all it took sometimes. A single thread that, when pulled with patience and persistence, could unravel an entire web of corruption. Max nudged her hand with his nose, ready to go. Sarah looked down at her partner of 7 years. Her companion through countless operations, her anchor in a world that often seemed chaotic and unjust. She scratched behind his ears and felt him lean into her touch. There was always more work to be done. More cases waiting, more victims needing advocates, more criminals believing they would never be caught. But for this moment, standing in the fading light of a summer evening, Sarah allowed herself to feel the quiet pride of a job well done. She and Max had made a difference. They had fought for people who could not fight for themselves. They had brought something resembling peace to those whose peace had been stolen, and tomorrow they would do it again. The city hummed around them as they walked to the car, the endless rhythm of Atlanta pulsing through streets and buildings and lives. Whatever came next, they would face it together as they always had. Partners, protectors, a team that would never stop hunting, never stop pursuing, never stop believing that justice was worth the fight. Sarah opened the rear door and Max jumped in, settling into his familiar spot with a contented sigh. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the courthouse. The road stretched ahead, winding through the city she had sworn to protect, leading toward whatever challenges waited in the days to come. They drove through the gathering dusk, 2 silhouettes against the glow of streetlights, heading home after another battle won. The fight was never truly over. But tonight, at least, the good guys had won. 3 weeks after the final sentencing, Sarah received a letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope, hand-addressed in shaky script that she recognized immediately. Mildred Patterson had written to thank her, to express in words what the elderly woman had not been able to say during their brief meeting at the courthouse. The letter was 3 pages long, filled with memories of her late husband, stories about the house they had built together, the children they had raised, the grandchildren who now carried their legacy forward. Mrs. Patterson wrote about how the theft had made her feel foolish and helpless, how she had blamed herself for being too old and too confused to protect what she and her husband had worked so hard to build. She wrote about the shame of having to ask her nephew for money, about the nights she lay awake wondering if she would have to leave her apartment, the home where she had lived for 43 years, and she wrote about the day when Sarah had knocked on her door, had listened to her story, had believed her when everyone else had dismissed her concerns. "You gave me back my dignity," the letter concluded. "You reminded me that my life has value, that my voice deserves to be heard. I cannot repay that gift, but I can tell you that every day I wake up grateful that someone like you exists in this world. Thank you, Lieutenant Collins. Thank you for fighting for an old woman who had given up on fighting for herself." Sarah read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of her desk where she kept the mementos that mattered most. She did not often allow herself to feel the emotional weight of her work. There was too much of it, too many cases, too many victims, too many moments when the system failed and justice remained elusive. But sometimes, on rare occasions, a letter like this broke through her professional armor and reminded her why she had chosen this path. Max padded into the room and sat beside her chair, his head tilting slightly as if sensing her mood. Sarah reached down and ran her fingers through his coat, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Partners, she thought. Through everything they remained partners. The investigation had taken a toll that she was only now beginning to acknowledge. The long hours, the emotional interviews, the constant pressure of building a case that could withstand every legal challenge. These demands had accumulated like sediment, weighing her down without her fully realizing it. Now, with the case closed and the sentences handed down, she felt the exhaustion settling into her bones. Her supervisor had suggested she take some time off, and for once, Sarah was inclined to agree. She had accrued months of unused leave, her dedication to duty coming at the expense of the rest and recovery that every officer needed. A week away from the job, maybe 2, might help restore the equilibrium that the case had disrupted. She began planning a trip to the mountains, a cabin in the Blue Ridge, where she could hike through forests and sit by streams and remember that the world contained beauty as well as ugliness. Max would love the open space, the new scents, the freedom to explore without the constraints of urban patrol. It would be good for both of them, but before she could finalize the arrangements, another letter arrived. This one was from Robert Chen, the retired engineer whose meticulous documentation had helped build the case against the fraud ring. Unlike Mrs. Patterson's emotional outpouring, Mr. Chen's letter was precise and organized, bullet points and numbered paragraphs that reflected his analytical mind. He wanted to discuss an idea he had been developing since the conclusion of the case. The fraud operation had succeeded in large part because its victims were isolated, disconnected from family members and community resources that might have noticed the irregularities sooner. Mr. Chen proposed creating a volunteer network, a group of trained individuals who would regularly check in on elderly neighbors, review their financial statements, and watch for signs of exploitation. He had already drafted a proposal complete with organizational structure, training curriculum, and budget projections. What he needed was someone with credibility to champion the idea, to approach civic organizations and law enforcement agencies, to turn his concept into reality. Sarah read the proposal with growing interest. The idea was sound, addressing a genuine need in a practical and sustainable way. Too often, law enforcement was reactive, responding to crimes after they occurred, rather than preventing them in the first place. Mr. Chen's network could serve as an early warning system, catching fraud schemes before they had a chance to inflict serious damage. She called him to discuss the proposal in detail. The conversation lasted 2 hours, ranging from logistical questions to philosophical debates about the proper role of community in protecting vulnerable members. By the end, Sarah had agreed to help him move forward. She would reach out to her contacts at the police department, at senior centers, at civic organizations across the metro area. Together, they would build something that might prevent others from suffering what the fraud victims had endured. The work began immediately, crowding into the space that Sarah had intended to reserve for rest and recovery. She did not mind. This was different from the grinding pressure of an active investigation. This was creation rather than destruction, building something new rather than tearing down something corrupt. The energy it demanded was replenished by the hope it generated. Within a month, the Atlanta Senior Protection Network had its first volunteers. Within 3 months, it had expanded to cover neighborhoods across the city. Local news stations ran stories about the program, featuring interviews with volunteers and testimonials from seniors who appreciated knowing that someone was watching out for them. The mayor issued a proclamation recognizing the network's contribution to community safety. Other cities began reaching out, asking how they could implement similar programs. Robert Chen became an unlikely activist, his wheelchair-bound presence a powerful symbol of resilience and determination. He spoke at community meetings, testified before city council, and gave countless interviews about the importance of protecting vulnerable populations. His engineering background served him well in these settings. His arguments built with the same precision he had once applied to bridge designs and structural calculations. Sarah stayed mostly in the background, content to let others take the public credit while she focused on the operational details. She recruited volunteers, developed training protocols, and coordinated with law enforcement agencies to ensure that reports of suspicious activity were properly handled. It was administrative work, lacking the adrenaline of tactical operations, but it satisfied something deeper in her, a need to create lasting change rather than simply responding to endless crises. Max adapted to the new routine with his characteristic flexibility. He accompanied Sarah to community meetings, his presence invariably drawing attention and providing opportunities to discuss the role of K-9 units in law enforcement. Children especially were fascinated by him, their parents hovering nervously until they saw how gentle he was, how patient with clumsy pats and excited voices. Sarah found these interactions unexpectedly rewarding, a reminder that her work had dimensions beyond the pursuit of criminals. Summer faded into autumn, the oppressive heat finally breaking as cool fronts pushed down from the north. The trees along Peachtree Street began to turn, their leaves shifting from green to gold to crimson, painting the city in colors that seemed almost too vivid to be real. Sarah took Max for long walks through Piedmont Park, watching the seasons change and reflecting on everything that had happened since that hot night at the bank deposit. The fraud case had been a turning point, though she had not recognized it at the time. It had forced her to look beyond the immediate demands of patrol work and consider the broader systems that enabled crime to flourish. The bank employees who had exploited their positions had not operated in a vacuum. They had succeeded because institutions were designed to trust insiders, because victims were conditioned to doubt their own perceptions, because society had constructed barriers between generations that left seniors isolated and vulnerable. Addressing those root causes required different tools than the ones Sarah typically employed. Handcuffs and search warrants were necessary, but not sufficient. Real change demanded education, community organizing, policy reform, and sustained attention to issues that rarely made headlines. It was slow work, frustrating work that often seemed futile in the face of entrenched interests and institutional inertia. But it was also work that mattered. Every volunteer trained, every senior connected to resources, every potential fraud averted, represented a small victory in an ongoing struggle. The cumulative impact might take years to become visible, but Sarah had learned to measure success in increments rather than leaps. Progress was progress, however modest. The mountain trip finally happened in late October, when the leaves were at their peak and the temperatures had dropped into the comfortable range that made hiking a pleasure rather than an ordeal. Sarah rented a cabin near Dahlonega, a small town in the foothills where gold had once been discovered and fortune seekers had flooded in pursuit of dreams. Now it was a quiet community of artists, retirees, and outdoor enthusiasts, the perfect antidote to the relentless pace of Atlanta. She spent her days exploring trails with Max, scrambling over rocky outcrops and wading through cold streams that made the dog's tail wag with delight. At night, she sat on the cabin's porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching stars emerge from a sky unpolluted by city lights. The silence was profound, broken only by the calls of owls and the rustle of creatures moving through the underbrush. It was during these quiet evenings that Sarah allowed herself to process everything she had experienced. The faces of the victims, the cold calculations of the perpetrators, the complexity of building a case that could survive the adversarial machinery of the legal system. She had carried these memories without examining them, too focused on the next task to dwell on what had already passed. Now, in the stillness of the mountains, she could finally let them settle into their proper place. She thought about Gregory Tran, the reluctant whistleblower whose testimony had been essential to securing convictions. He had been sentenced to 2 years of probation, his cooperation earning him the leniency that Sarah had promised. She wondered where he was now, whether he had managed to rebuild his life, whether the guilt he carried had found some resolution. Perhaps he was working at another coffee shop, serving lattes to customers who had no idea about the choices he had made and the consequences he had faced. She thought about Daniel Mercer, the mastermind whose charm and intelligence had been twisted toward exploitation rather than service. 25 years was a long sentence, but it seemed almost inadequate given the scope of the harm he had caused. How many seniors had spent their final years in anxiety and confusion because of his greed? How many family relationships had been strained by financial pressures that should never have existed? Some crimes could not be measured in dollars alone. She thought about Mildred Patterson and Robert Chen and all the other victims whose names filled the case file. They had endured not just financial loss, but a fundamental betrayal of trust, a violation that cut deeper than any amount of restitution could heal. The money returned to them was necessary, but not sufficient. What they truly needed was the assurance that their society valued them, that their vulnerability would be protected rather than exploited, that growing old did not mean becoming invisible. These reflections did not resolve into neat conclusions. The world was too complicated for easy answers, too resistant to the kind of clarity that made for satisfying endings. But the act of reflection itself was valuable, a way of honoring the experiences she had witnessed and carrying them forward as motivation for continued effort. Max seemed to understand her mood, staying close throughout the week, his steady presence a comfort that required no words. They developed new rhythms together, morning hikes followed by afternoon naps on the porch, evening meals of simple food eaten while watching the sunset paint the mountains in impossible colors. It was a temporary paradise, a pause in the relentless flow of duty and responsibility, and Sarah savored every moment. When the week ended and they returned to Atlanta, Sarah felt restored in ways she had not anticipated. The exhaustion that had accumulated during the investigation had lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and possibility. The city looked different somehow, its familiar streets and buildings imbued with potential rather than merely presenting problems to be solved. She returned to work with fresh energy, diving back into the patrol schedule and the ongoing demands of the K-9 unit. But she also maintained her involvement with the Senior Protection Network, carving out time each week to meet with volunteers, review reports, and coordinate with community partners. The dual focus stretched her capacity, but also enriched her perspective, reminding her that law enforcement was just one tool among many in the ongoing effort to build a safer society. The winter months brought new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to apply the lessons she had learned. A series of break-ins targeting small businesses led to a weeks-long investigation that eventually identified a crew of young offenders who were stealing to support various personal needs. Rather than simply processing them through the criminal justice system, Sarah worked with prosecutors and social workers to develop intervention plans that addressed underlying issues while still holding the perpetrators accountable. A dispute between neighbors over property boundaries escalated into threats of violence, requiring delicate mediation that drew on all of Sarah's interpersonal skills. She spent hours listening to grievances on both sides, identifying common ground and gradually steering the parties toward a resolution that preserved their dignity while diffusing the immediate danger. It was not the kind of work that made headlines, but it prevented harm and strengthened community bonds. Throughout these varied demands, Max remained her constant companion, his instincts and abilities an extension of her own capabilities. The bond between Handler and K-9 deepened with each passing month, their communication becoming ever more nuanced, their coordination increasingly seamless. Sarah sometimes marveled at how much she could convey with a gesture, a word, a shift in posture, and how accurately Max interpreted her intentions. Spring arrived with its familiar explosion of color, dogwoods and azaleas transforming the city into a garden that seemed incongruous with its urban character. Sarah marked the anniversary of the fraud case with a quiet dinner at her favorite restaurant, raising a glass to absent victims and present partners. Max lay under the table, accepting scraps of grilled chicken with dignified appreciation. The senior protection network continued to grow, expanding beyond Atlanta into neighboring counties and eventually into other states. Robert Chen became a national advocate for elder protection, traveling to conferences and legislative hearings despite his physical limitations. His testimony before a congressional subcommittee helped advance legislation requiring financial institutions to implement stronger safeguards against elder fraud. Mildred Patterson passed away in her sleep the following summer, surrounded by family members who had reconnected with her during the final months of her life. Her nephew flew in from Oregon to handle the arrangements and to personally thank Sarah for everything she had done. The funeral was small but deeply moving, a celebration of a life that had nearly been diminished by greed, but had instead been affirmed by justice. Sarah attended in her dress uniform, Max wearing a ceremonial harness that marked him as a service animal. She did not speak at the service, but her presence communicated everything that needed to be said. She had fought for Mildred Patterson, and that fight had made a difference. Not all stories ended happily, but this one had at least ended with dignity preserved and wrongs acknowledged. Life in Atlanta continued its relentless rhythm, the city growing and changing around them, while Sarah and Max maintained their watch. New towers rose along the skyline, new neighborhoods emerged from former industrial zones, new challenges presented themselves with each passing season. The nature of crime evolved as technology advanced, but the fundamental dynamics remained constant. There were always those who sought to exploit the vulnerable, and there were always those who stood against them. Sarah found herself mentoring younger officers, sharing the lessons she had accumulated over years of service. She taught them not just techniques and procedures, but also the philosophy that guided her approach: patience, persistence, respect for the people they served, even those they pursued. The understanding that behind every case file was a human story, often complex, rarely simple, always deserving of consideration. One evening, as autumn settled over Atlanta again, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at the precinct. A young woman in her mid-20s approached the front desk and asked to speak with Lieutenant Collins specifically. When Sarah came down to meet her, she found herself facing someone whose features seemed vaguely familiar, but whom she could not immediately place. The young woman introduced herself as Jennifer Mercer, Daniel Mercer's daughter. Sarah's guard went up immediately, her mind racing through possibilities of confrontation or accusation. But Jennifer's demeanor was not hostile. If anything, she seemed nervous, uncertain, carrying a burden that she had brought here to share. They found a quiet conference room where they could speak privately. Max, sensing no threat, settled at Sarah's feet with his customary patience. Jennifer sat across the table, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes struggling to meet Sarah's gaze. She had come to apologize, she said. Not on behalf of her father, whose crime she could not excuse or explain, but for herself. She had known that something was wrong in her family's finances for years. The lifestyle they enjoyed, the house, the cars, the country club membership. None of it made sense on a bank manager's salary. She'd asked questions occasionally, and her father had always deflected with vague references to wise investments and family money. She had wanted to believe him. She had chosen to believe him. But the investigation and trial had forced her to confront the truth. Her father was a thief, a predator who had systematically exploited the most vulnerable members of their community for personal gain. The money that had paid for her education, her car, her comfortable upbringing, all of it had been stolen from people like Mildred Patterson and Robert Chen. People who had worked their entire lives and deserved better than to have their savings stolen by someone they trusted. Jennifer's voice cracked as she described the shame she felt, the guilt that had become her constant companion since the truth emerged. She had cut ties with her father, refusing to visit him in prison, refusing to accept his calls. Her mother had divorced him and moved out of state, unable to face the neighbors who had learned the source of their family's wealth. Jennifer had stayed in Atlanta, determined to make amends somehow, but unsure how to begin. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression neutral, but her heart softening toward this young woman who was clearly suffering. Jennifer had not committed any crime. She had been a beneficiary of her father's actions, but that was not the same as being complicit. The sins of parents should not be visited upon their children, even when those sins were severe. When Jennifer finished speaking, Sarah took a moment to gather her thoughts. Then she told Jennifer about the Senior Protection Network, about the ongoing work to prevent other families from experiencing what the fraud victims had endured. She explained that volunteer positions were available, that people with financial knowledge were especially valuable in helping seniors understand and protect their assets. If Jennifer truly wanted to make amends, here was a concrete way to begin. Jennifer's eyes widened with something like hope. She had been searching for a path forward, a way to transform her guilt into something constructive. The volunteer opportunity Sarah described seemed almost too perfect, a chance to directly address the harm her family had caused. She asked for more information, and Sarah promised to connect her with the network coordinators. As Jennifer left the precinct, Sarah reflected on the unexpected dimensions of justice. Holding criminals accountable was essential, but it was only part of the equation. True healing required something more, a restoration of community, a reweaving of the social fabric that crime had torn. Jennifer Mercer's desire to contribute represented a kind of redemption that the legal system could not provide. It was a reminder that human beings were capable of growth, of change, of choosing differently than those who had shaped them. The encounter stayed with Sarah for days afterward, adding another layer to her understanding of the fraud case and its aftermath. She had focused so intently on the perpetrators and victims that she had not considered the collateral damage, the family members and friends who discovered that someone they loved was capable of terrible things. These people were also wounded by the crimes, forced to reconstruct their understanding of relationships and trust. She mentioned the meeting to Robert Chen during their regular coordination call. He was silent for a long moment, processing the information. Then he said something that surprised her. He wanted to meet Jennifer Mercer, not to confront her or blame her, but to talk. He wanted to understand her perspective, to see the human being behind the family name that had caused him so much suffering. Perhaps, he suggested, such a meeting might help them both find some measure of peace. Sarah arranged the meeting, mediating an initial conversation that was awkward and emotional but ultimately productive. Robert and Jennifer discovered common ground in their shared desire to prevent future fraud, their mutual commitment to protecting vulnerable seniors. Over the following months, they developed an unlikely partnership, combining Robert's analytical rigor with Jennifer's insider knowledge of how financial institutions operated. Together, they developed training materials that help volunteers identify red flags and intervention strategies that bank employees could use to protect at-risk clients. The collaboration was not always smooth. Old wounds occasionally resurfaced, and there were moments when the weight of history threatened to overwhelm the fragile bridge they were building. But both parties remained committed to the larger purpose, understanding that their personal healing was intertwined with the broader work of community protection. Sarah watched this relationship evolve with a mixture of admiration and wonder. She had spent her career pursuing justice through traditional means, arresting criminals and building cases and securing convictions. But what she was witnessing now was something different, something that existed outside the formal structures of law enforcement. It was restorative rather than punitive, healing rather than punishing, creating new possibilities rather than merely addressing past wrongs. She began to see her role differently. The badge and the uniform and the authority they represented were tools, necessary but not sufficient. The real work of justice required human connection, the willingness to see complexity in situations that seemed simple, the patience to nurture growth even in the most unlikely circumstances. It required recognizing that every person, regardless of their history or associations, contained the potential for both harm and healing. This realization did not make her job easier. If anything, it made it more demanding, requiring her to engage with each situation as a unique puzzle rather than applying standard solutions to standard problems. But it also made the work more meaningful, more aligned with the values that had drawn her to law enforcement in the first place. Max seemed to sense the shift in her perspective, responding to her moods with the sensitivity that had always characterized their partnership. On quiet evenings, when Sarah sat reviewing case files or preparing training materials, he would rest his head on her lap, offering comfort without demands. During challenging moments when frustration or doubt threatened to overwhelm her, he would nudge her hand, reminding her that she was not alone. Their bond transcended the professional relationship between Handler and K-9. They had become family, their lives intertwined in ways that went beyond duty schedules and operational procedures. Sarah could not imagine doing this work without Max, and she suspected he felt the same way about her. Together, they had faced dangers and solved crimes and helped people who desperately needed assistance. Together, they would continue that mission for as long as they were able. Max aged gracefully, his muzzle showing traces of gray, his movements slightly slower than in his younger years. But his instincts remained sharp, his dedication unwavering. He continued to serve alongside Sarah, their partnership a model that inspired handlers throughout the department. When younger K-9s joined the unit, Max seemed to take them under his tutelage, demonstrating behaviors and sharing wisdom in whatever wordless ways dogs communicate with each other. The fraud case became part of departmental law, studied in training sessions as an example of how persistence and collaboration could unravel even sophisticated criminal enterprises. Sarah occasionally lectured on the investigation, walking through the timeline and highlighting key decision points. She always emphasized the role of the victims whose courage in coming forward had made the case possible. Without their willingness to trust again after being so deeply betrayed, justice would have remained beyond reach. She also emphasized Max's contribution, that initial alert at the night deposit that had started everything. Handlers in training were always fascinated by this detail, the reminder that their four-legged partners could perceive things that humans might miss. Trust your dog, Sarah would tell them. They see what we cannot see. They know what we cannot know. Our job is to recognize when they are trying to tell us something and to follow where they lead. The years accumulated like chapters in a book, each one adding new experiences and insights to the narrative that defined her career. There were moments of triumph and moments of failure, cases solved and cases that remained stubbornly opaque. There were colleagues who became friends, and friends who moved on to other positions, other cities, other chapters of their own lives. Through it all, Sarah maintained her focus on the work that mattered, the daily effort to make Atlanta a little safer, a little more just, a little more worthy of the people who called it home. And through it all, Max was there, watching, waiting, ready. In the back seat, the aging Belgian Malinois lifted his head briefly, ears perked towards some distant sound only he could hear. Before settling back into watchful rest, he was ready, he was always ready, for whatever came next. And so was she.